Hey, this is James, and in this video I'm going to be doing a walkthrough of my second Oracle card deck, so stay tuned. Thanks so much for tuning in and joining me for this special video. I am so happy to have you here as I explore with you my second Oracle card deck, the Intuitive Coaching Oracle. So the deck was inspired by a conversation I had with a prospective coaching client last month. So I'm shooting this video in July of 2020. It's actually July the 15th. And so I had this conversation with this client on June the 11th, 2020. So the interesting thing to note with that is it was 3 months to the day where I was inspired to create my very first Oracle card deck, the Oracle of Himm, which was inspired on March the 11th, 2020. So 3 months later to the day, I was inspired to create the second deck, which totally caught me off guard. I did not see a second deck coming, and especially so soon. But the client, like I said, inspired me. And the interesting thing about it wasn't anything that was profound stated or said in the conversation, but I think it was in light of the fact that my business had taken a hit as a result of the pandemic experience that we're all having together, right? And so it was very interesting to note that the first deck, the Oracle of Himm, was actually birthed during that time when the United States was experiencing its first wave of this experience. So I thought that was an interesting time to get creative and make a deck. And I think, as I said in my video walkthrough of that, and if you haven't watched it and you're interested, I will leave a link to that video in the description box below. But I said at that time that I felt that it was a coping mechanism in the way from Spirit and the angels, because that's an angel deck, Spirit and the angels, to help me through that experience on a personal level, to help me move through it. I think the same thing with this particular deck, because at the time, if you are keeping up with what's going on in the world aside from the pandemic, at that time, on top of that, as if a pandemic wasn't enough, here in the United States, we were having the Black Lives Matter movement, and that was heating up. And so I think in light of what you're going to see in some of the cards in this deck, I think that was just a way, again, on maybe a subconscious level, of me processing that event, those circumstances. And again, it was just a very creative way to kind of maybe channel that energy. I wasn't aware of it on a conscious level. But like I said, once I got the deck together and I looked at the cards, really looked at the cards, I could see how that would be a response, in a way, my intuitive coaching, creative response to that particular current event. So I think it was coupled with the idea that the coaching client kind of maybe gave me some new inspiration or new thought about my business, because I was thinking that the business was pretty much done at this point, because I was really not working with a whole lot of clients. I didn't have a whole lot of client activity, especially coaching. Readings are different. I was still doing those, and I wasn't doing as many then as I am now. I'm blessed to say that I'm busier with the readings, but the coaching clients, I don't have that many of these days. So I was very aware that something was taking place there with that. So, like I said, so that's the inspiration for the deck. I recently just got the initial test copy, and I will say from the outset that this is a deck that I'm feeling more inclined to offer to the public at some point. So, without further ado, because I've kind of teased that now, I'm going to move to the next segment where I'm going to shift the camera closer to the table and show you all the cards. Now, I will say this at the get-go. This is going to be a long video because there are a lot of cards in this deck. I didn't realize I was feeling inspired to create such a huge deck. But you'll get the gist of why it is the way it is when you see the cards. So now let's move to the table and start that process now. And here we are with the deck on the table. And I wanted to start off by showing you the backs of the cards. So these are the card backs. And this is a picture of the Orion Nebula. And so there's a little story about the card back image. And so for me, my branding archetype in business is called the Magician or the Wizard. There are 12 branding archetypes, and all businesses fall into one dominant or primary archetype with a secondary backup archetype. And so my primary is the Magician, like I said. And the Magician is all about change and transformation. That is the core meaning of the brand archetype. And coaching is a process where the coach and the coachee, the client, work together to create change in the client's life, right? So it's a change and transformative process, coaching is. And so when I was doing research on this particular brand archetype, I discovered a lot of the imagery that goes along with this brand archetype has to do with things like space and images of galaxies and stars, you know, things like that. So, of course, that falls in line with my personal spiritual belief system. And so it was very easy for me to find images of space and galaxies. And I had a couple. So what I did was I used this one as the card backs. And so now that I've shown you that, I'm going to turn the entire deck over because I put the deck in alphabetical order. So now I will show you the second picture because I couldn't decide. So I wanted to do something with this image as well. So it became my title card. So here's the title card. And this is a secondary image of space. And so the title card has the name of the deck, which is the Intuitive Coaching Oracle, and my copyright in terms of the year the deck was created, which is 2020, and then my website URL at the bottom of the title card. Okay, so that's the title card. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the cards one by one. So I'm just going to start off by saying it's a pretty massive deck. There are 116 cards, not including the title card. So you're probably wondering, like, why so many cards? Why 116? It's because there are a number of variant cards. When it came to a particular image, I couldn't decide in some cases, so I went with 2. And there are some other cards that are extra, and there's a point in mind or an intention in mind, and I'll talk about those when I get to them. So let's move on. First card is Abundance and Prosperity. Next is Acceptance and Forgiveness. So the meaning of this card is sometimes when we want to create change in our lives, we have to get to a place of acceptance and accepting where we are in the moment. And sometimes with that, there is some sort of forgiveness work that may need to take place. So this card can be asking if you resonate with the forgiveness aspect of the card when it turns up. It's about who do you need to forgive? Do you need to forgive others? Or more importantly, do you need to forgive yourself? And so I put this as acceptance and forgiveness because I believe in some cases they go hand in hand. So that's acceptance, forgiveness. Next we have accountability, and the image is quite simple. The coach in the coaching relationship is the accountability partner. So he or she, their main job or focus is holding the client accountable for the change he or she wants to create, right? So which is why the image has finger pointing at you, right? If change is going to take place, it's going to take place because of you. Right? So that's accountability. Next up we have achievement. I'm a superhero person, so this is action. And so the superhero theme comes up for me in a couple of ways. Number one, it's asking the question, what is your superpower? And that's a nice way of asking the question like, what is your gift? What is your talent? What is your unique and special ability? That kind of thing. The theme of the deck for me is about empowerment, right? And what better image to represent empowerment than superheroes, right? But the action card is all about coaching being an action-oriented process, right? You and the coach create an action plan, and then you move your plan forward by taking the necessary action steps, right, to make whatever the vision is a reality. But another meaning of this card for me can represent like what kind of good do you want to do in the world, right? Because all superheroes are do-gooders, right? So there's action. Next up we have adventure. And this is one of two adventure cards. So I love this image again because I am a comic book action adventure type person. So I love this card for me. The image makes me think of like being a thrill seeker, seeking excitement, that kind of thing. And it's also a nod to, and I'm old enough to say it, to action movies in the early 70s where they starred prominently a black female as the lead, right? So there's a nod to that for me. So that's one adventure card. Here's the other. And so here we have a person on the top of a mountain. So for me, this is a nod also to mountain in Lenormand. So when this card comes up, it can represent, you know, needing to climb a mountain, overcome a mountain. You know, it could be reaching a peak, reaching a pinnacle. But in Lenormand, mountain can represent a challenge, a block, or an obstacle. So this card could suggest there's an obstacle that needs to be overcome when it turns up. So that is adventure. We have two advisor cards. So this is advisor, the first one. And what I love about this image is that the person, the man on the card, is standing out because he's in color and everyone else around him is in a monochromatic tone. So for me, one of its meanings can represent like standing out from the crowd, you know, breaking out of the pack. But advisor in and of itself can represent a need for some type of advice, you know, or needing to go through a necessary process. And who do you need to consult for that? There are many different advisors that you may need to consult with. In the business sense, this card can represent an advisory board because there's more than one person on the card. But I just love the fact that there's a person of color prominently featured on the card. And I love the pink of his suit. I'm not going to lie. So that is one advisor card. And here's the second one. And so for those of you who know that I read Kipper, I look at this card as advisor in Kipper, which is sometimes known as court person. And so for me, because there's two people on the card, this is a connector card. So I pay attention to the cards that are on either side of this card in a line of cards. But it carries the same meaning as the previous advisor, you know, needing to undergo a necessary process and maybe getting or seeking the advice of a professional. So you could think about like financial advisors, tax advisors, legal advisors, you know, all different types of advisors would fall under the meanings of this card. Next up we have ancestors. So this is one ancestor card. This has a singular ancestor on it. And again, this card was inspired or birthed during the Black Lives Matter movement a month ago. That started a month ago. We're still in that process, of course. But it made me reflective on ancestors and ancestor work, you know, from a more spiritual standpoint. But that is a singular ancestor. And then I have the plural ancestors. And both cards could represent, you know, influences that have been passed down. You know, the idea where people say things like, oh, this is the way it's always been done. in terms of like a family environment, family situation. This is the way we've always done it, kind of thing, right? But in coaching, sometimes when a person is blocked or stuck and can't move forward, sometimes it's the result of an influence that has been passed down, right? So sometimes I have to ask the client, like, whose voice is that speaking right now? When the person expresses a limiting belief, you know, kind of thing. So that is ancestors. Next up is angels. And just because I'm an angel person, I wanted to have a card that represents angels. So this could just represent a spiritual team, your spiritual network. But it can also represent divine messages, divine guidance, if you're not an angel person. So that's angels, and I love the image. Next up, we have balance. So that is a person doing a tree pose in yoga. So that's a secondary meaning of the card. It could represent an actual yoga practice or practitioner. You know, in a challenging sense, it could be, you know, the idea of having one leg to stand on. Now, I am not yoga fluent, but I do believe that the tree pose, its intention is to help build strength and endurance. So that could be a secondary or underlying meaning of the card. But that's balance. Here we have beliefs. And I love the image. I'm a candle person, so I love the tea light candle and I love the coloring. And so beliefs play a large part in the coaching-client relationship, right? Because the coach gets to hear all the beliefs that the client has about achieving his or her goal or goals, depending on what it is that they want to work on. So this card represents beliefs, so it can represent beliefs and belief systems, right? So that's beliefs. Next up we have block. And what my intention was with this deck when I set out to create it is I wanted some more challenging cards in the deck than in my previous deck, the Oracle of Himm. And so I also wanted them to be kind of pretty straightforward, right? So you get the idea with this card. It's about hitting a wall, right? Or having your walls up. Now, in a more cartomantic type reading, this card can also represent a building, right? Because buildings are made up of walls, right? So this could be you hit a wall, or depending on the context, when I'm doing a reading, context is everything, meaning the question is key, right? And you read to the question. But this card in and of itself can represent hitting a wall. So it represents your block. And how do you get past your block? And the reason why I like this one is because of all the colors in the brick. So that's why I chose that one. But that's block. Next up we have blueprint. So blueprint is all about drawing up the plan, right? And the coach and the coachee work on drawing up a plan, creating a plan, right? And in that lens, the client is the architect, right, of his or her life, right? And so I always say that this is about drawing up a plan that you can live with, right? So that's blueprint. Next up, we have bridging the gap. I love this card. So the bridge is a symbol of getting from point A to point B, right? So I love the fact that even with the deck being in alphabetical order, is that this card follows blueprint, right? So here we have, following the plan, how do we bridge the gap from where the person is to where they want to be or go or end up, right? Now, secondary meaning of this card is reconciliation, because the bridge is also a symbol for that. And with that, I was specific about wanting to find a bridge that had water underneath it, because it's, you know, of the pun about water under the bridge. So that's bridging the gap. Next up, we have business. One of the things that I coach people with or through is I work with spiritual practitioners who want to take that spiritual practice and turn it into a business. So I usually work with them setting up the initial stages of their business. But I like this. So this person on the card is looking at different screens. So this is about like exploring your options for business. And the suit is a pun for when you're going into business, a business that is well suited for you. Right, so that is business. Next up is one of three cards that talk about the systems of cards that I work with. So first up we have Cartomancy. So Cartomancy is a card for me that's a nod to playing cards. It's a nod to Lenormand, Kipper, all of which I use in my practice with clients. And so this card talks about those systems being more grounded. They have more of a predictive quality. So if you're not a cartomancer and this card came up, it could simply be talking about, needing to be grounded, needing to be realistic about what it is that you want to do. It may be that you also may need to play a hunch, which is the idea about prediction, right? This could also be about playing the hand that you're dealt. Putting your cards on the table, or do you need to keep them close to the vest? All those types of things that come up with the symbolism of playing cards. It's not just about reading cards. But that is Cartomancy. That's one of three. Like I said, it talks about the different systems I use with clients. Next up is commitment. And so commitment is all about the agreements that the client and the coach make or form in their relationship. And two, one of the things that I ask for commitments at the end of every session. I ask the client, what is he or she committed to doing in the time span between sessions? And so this card can represent agreements being made between two parties, honoring your commitments, keeping your promises. It's kind of like Ring in Lenormand, if you're familiar with Lenormand, right? And that card is about agreements, contracts, unions, mergers. This could be about deals, especially like with the business card, making a deal. The idea of like, let's shake on it. But it can also be a card about meetings and introductions, right? Because formally, what we do 9 times out of 10, at least here in the States, I know there are different cultural norms depending on where you are in the world when it comes to meetings and introductions. But here in the States, more often than not, we shake hands. And I'm saying that with the idea that this is pre-social distancing, right? Where we're not in the stage to come within a certain amount of feet of each other now. But before then, a lot of times introductions were formalized with a handshake. Right, so that is commitment. Next up is communication. And so this card represents all types of communication, which is why there's a picture of an iPhone on the card. Right, so not only does it represent communication, both verbal and nonverbal, right, because you can check email, text messages, all those kinds of things on your smartphone these days, but it can also represent computers and technology, because I tend to think of a smartphone as a pocket-sized computer, yeah? So this card, again, is about communication, but also about computers and technology. Next up, one of my favorite cards in the deck because it's so simple, the imagery. This is conditioning and programming, and it's really, the gist of this card is about the old tapes, right? We're looking at an old cassette tape, right? The old tapes that we play in our heads, right? When we're wanting to create change, right? Those old tapes could be limiting beliefs that we've adopted, that we have taken on and believe as being true, right? And what I love about the image, not only is it an old tape, but the tape is being spooled out. So it's about like undoing, or undoing that conditioning, undoing that programming, right? So there is conditioning and programming. Next up, we have conscious. So conscious is all about state of consciousness, meaning becoming more aware. And I just love the image, right? It has a cosmic vibe or feel to it. But that is conscious. Next up, we have course correction. And this is pretty straightforward. I found a background image of a road, and then I superimposed a detour sign over that. And so sometimes we have to adjust our plan, right? And so that's what this card can mean. It represents, on some level, needing to adjust your course, right? So that's course correction. Next up is another one of my favorite cards, and I'm going to slide this over because there's a little bit of a glare. Next up, we have curtain call. This is for when the work between the coach and the client comes to a natural state of completion or conclusion. You stop and think about the curtain coming down, right? The show is over, that kind of thing. As a tarot person, I equate this card with death in tarot, and in Lenormand, I equate it to coffin, right? Because both of those cards can represent an ending or a completion, right? So that is curtain call. Now, curtain call, secondary meaning, underlying meaning, could be about, what stage are you at within your situation or experience, right? This card can be about the theater, right? If we go with the idea about the curtain, right? So this could be about the theater. And with that in mind, it could turn up to say, what role are you playing in this experience? What's your role? What are you bringing to the stage, metaphorically? So that's curtain call. Next up, we have depth. So I love this image. And this could be a card that talks about emotional overwhelm as a possibility in a challenging sense. For me, the thought of this card was that coaching can be a process where we go deep, depending on what it is that we are working on. And what I love about the image is that the woman has her hands over her face. And so sometimes this is about, when we go deep, are you willing to face certain things? Because sometimes we are and sometimes we're not. I'm thinking of the expression like, I'm not ready to go there, kind of thing, right? But this card usually represents going deeper. Next up, we have direction. And I love the image. So the image is a map. And the map symbolically represents showing you where you are, right? Maps show us where we are in relation to where we want to go. And then what we do is we plot out the best route or course to get from where we are to where we want to be. And I love the image because there's a pendulum above the map. And so that sound you heard in the background is the cat that I am cat sitting. She has just come in from outside. So you may hear her, and it's okay. We're just going to continue on. Next up, we have Divine Design. And so my intention is that this is a card that talks about spirituality and the universe. And so it's a sharp contrast to the Blueprint card, because the Blueprint card can represent your plan, and then the Divine Design card represents God's plan, right? And sometimes they're not the same, right? So this is Divine Design. Next up, we have the Dream Decoding card. And so this is another service that I provide with certain clients. And sometimes we do dream work. And so this card reflects that. So when it turns up in a reading, it could suggest, like, is there a dream you need to work with? Is there a dream that you need to interpret? I'm a big proponent of dreams because a lot of the things that I've experienced in life have been the result of honoring a sleep dream that I had that came before the experience. Right? So this card can also be talking about your waking life dreams. Like, what do you dream of? You know, what do you aspire to? Those kinds of things. And now this is a nod to Kippur. Because there's a bed on the card, it can represent things having to do with rest, sleep, sex, and sexual relations. Right? So again, context would let me know which meaning is going to be the best one that fits the reading at hand, right? But those are some of the meanings that I have for dream decoding, aside from the obvious about working with your dreams. Next up, we have one of two cards for empowerment. So again, this kind of has like a superhero vibe kind of feel. And then here's the second. And the idea here, again, with the superhero kind of theme here, is about like stepping into your power. Right? Are you willing to embrace your power, or is it just going to be something that's just in the background? Right? Next up, we have the energy card. And so this is about, managing your energy. What are you putting your energy into? But it can also represent energy work and energy workers, energy practitioners, right? And I've talked about this in the past for myself, that as a Reiki practitioner, I work with the universal life force, which is energy, right? But the chief meaning of this, if you're not an energy worker, is what are you putting your energy into? Next up, we have Epiphany. This is a card of an aha, a revelation. And I love the image. It looks like his eyes are being opened. And then you could see the workings of his mind as he's receiving that insight, that guidance, yeah? That revelation. I love the image. And some of these have directional cues, right? Because he's facing the right, the card to the right might give us more insight in a reading as to what the epiphany is about. That's Epiphany. Next up, we have a few family cards. So this is the first. And so this could represent a smaller size family. But I love the image. So that's one family card. Next up, we have this family card with a medium-sized family, like a nuclear type family. And then the third is a larger family. Whoops. A larger family. And so I love this. Again, I wanted the deck to be accessible to the diverse types of clients that I work with. I work with not just one type of client, but I work with different types of clients. I'm blessed in that regard to work with a diverse group of people. And so I wanted cards that would represent, to the best of my ability, all those different types of people, which is why I have 3 different types of family cards. And so when I'm working with a client and I'm doing a reading, I will pull out a family card or put a family card in the deck prior to the reading that I feel best reflects that person. Right? So we have 3 different types of families in terms of ethnicity, but also family size. So those are the 3 family cards. Next up, we have Fork in the Road. So this is a card that talks about, being at a crossroads or a metaphorical fork in the road and needing to make a choice as to which way you want to go. If you are fluent in Lenormand, this would be akin to crossroads in that. So this card can also represent choices, options, alternatives. It could represent your path in life. But the question that comes up with this card is, which way do we go? Right? It's about choosing the best course. And what I love about the image, there's a little signpost at the fork in the road. So for me, a secondary message of this card is about looking for the signs along the way that will help you know which way to go. And the thing about signs is that the signs may not be big and flashing and neon. They could be small and subtle. And our job is when we're asking for a sign is to pay attention, because anything and everything could be a sign. Right? But that is fork in the road. Next up, we have fresh start. And so this card represents being at a new phase, something beginning, the start of something. It could be with the words fresh start, about wiping the slate clean, starting fresh. But because there's a baby on the card, it's also akin to like child in Lenormand or child in Kipper. So this could represent an actual child. But it can also represent something that it's in its infancy stage, right? Because it's an infant on the card. But that is fresh start, and I love the image. Isn't she cute? Next up, we have goals. And so goals is really what's at the heart of a coach and coachee relationship. A coaching relationship is, what are the goals? You know, what are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to accomplish? What I love about the image is that there's more than one arrow. There's one dominant arrow, and there are other few arrows. And sometimes it's about, repetition. Sometimes we may not hit the mark the first time, and we may have to go back and do it again and again and again, right? So that's goals. Next up, we have Ideal Day. So Ideal Day is a card that has a built-in coaching exercise to it. Some of the cards have. This is one of those. Now, the visualization that goes with this is about picturing your ideal or perfect day, right? So what I usually do is I ask the client to imagine that the issue that has brought them to see me as a coach is no longer a thing. They have gotten to the other side of that issue. They have now accomplished their goal or achieved their goal. What does their life look like? And then I ask them to describe the most ideal or perfect day. And then what they're doing really is they're creating a picture of what their life could look like. And then what we do is, how close can we get to that picture with the action plan, the blueprint that we draw, right? So that is Ideal Day. But because it's a picture of a sky, it could represent the atmosphere. An atmosphere. Are you in the right atmosphere? Or the atmosphere of a room, of relationship. It could also be talking about the weather, right? And the fact that it's an ideal day, this could represent daytime, daylight, things like that. So that's Ideal Day. Next, we have Ideation. So this is just the idea card. It represents like the light bulb going off, getting that big idea, that great idea. But it also talks about everything starts with an idea. Right? Everything that we use in the physical 3D experience was a result of an idea. Right? So that's Ideation. Next up, we have Image Identity. Right? And so sometimes when we're doing work on changing our lives, sometimes we have to take a look at who we are and who do we need to become in order for us to achieve that goal or accomplish that goal, right? And so because I'm a fan of mirror work, that's another meaning of this card. But this is about reflection, image, identity, taking a look at yourself, those kinds of things. Next up, we have Inspiration. And so this card can turn up to say, what inspires you? Right? But I love the image. It's like a mandala or a mandala. Next up, the Intuitive Coach card. So I wanted a card just like I did in my Oracle of Himm. That would be a personal significator card, so this is it. And so I call myself an intuitive coach. And so it brings both those elements together into my work. And so what I love about the image is that one hand represents intuiting, and then the other hand represents listening. And coaching is a listening process. My job as a coach is to listen to what the clients are saying to me. And sometimes, with the image identity card being a symbol of a mirror, sometimes I reflect back to them what I've heard them say. And one of the things I learned in my coach training is that in the coaching session, the coach should be talking 20% of the time, which means that the client should be doing the majority of the talking. If the coach is doing a lot of talking, something's wrong in that relationship. Right? And so now I talked about directional cues and visual cues with certain cards. This one carries with it a visual cue. Right? So the card that would be on the left, on this side, if there were 3 cards, this would be what is being intuited, right? Because this side is all about the intuition and being led and guided by that. And then the card on the right may be what it is that needs to be heard or listened to. Now, in a spiritual sense, this is a nod to my dominant clairs, the first being clairvoyance and the second being clairaudience. Right? So that is the intuitive coach card. Next up, we have journaling. So journaling is a process in coaching where the client may be invited to write down his or her thoughts as they're moving through their work. But this card can also be about, writing. It could be about study and learning. I equate this in some respects to book in Lenormand. Right? So that in that system, book is about education, study, learning, a project, but it could also be about working with books. So this could be an author, this could be a novelist. It could be about keeping records, bookkeeping, depending on the context and surrounding cards. But that is journaling. Next up, we have juggling. So this card represents multitasking, right? Having a lot going on, having a few balls in the air, metaphorically speaking. But it can also be a nod to the juggler card in Tarot de Marseille, because that is the system that I work with. And in that respect, the juggler, which is also the magician, is a street performer, right? So this card can be about, performing out in public in that regard. So that is juggling. Next up, we have knowledge, and I love the image. So this is about maybe needing to read up on something. It could be about expanding your knowledge because of the circular pattern of the books. But it can also represent libraries, bookstores, any place where books are held or stored. Next, we have limitation and restriction. So here we have the image of a parrot behind bars. This is barbed wire, right? So it's all about the ways that we limit and restrict ourselves, right? And the reason for the parrot as a symbol is that for me, parrots repeat what it is that they've been told, right? And so how often are we repeating things that somebody else has told us, right? And so this goes back to the ancestors cards, right, where we talk about, influences that have been passed down, and whose voice is that in your head, right? Or whose voice is that speaking that particular belief, right? So it could just be like, are we parroting something that somebody else has told us? And how is that keeping us stuck? How is that limiting and restricting us? How are we holding ourselves back with that? right? So that is limitation and restriction. Now, of course, it could also represent the idea of being trapped, confined. In some cases, this might be even incarceration, with the idea about being behind bars, that kind of thing. Next up we have, this is a nod to both Lenormand and Kipper, because I love it so much. I wanted a man card in the deck. So here is the one that I personally like. And so I said the one I personally like because I have a number of them. Because again, I wanted cards that would represent a wide, diverse range of men. And so the man card, because I have a personal significator card in the deck already that represents me, this would be a male client or a male seeker, right? So if I'm doing a reading for a man and this card came up, it would represent that man. If I'm doing a reading for a woman, this might be a man who's significant to her in context to what it is that we're looking at in the cards or in the reading, right? So this is a man, and I read with direction in mind. So he's facing to the left. So all the cards that he would be looking at, they would become a line of sight reading. And so that would be like, what is he looking at? What is coming up for him? Excuse me. And then the other side would be like, what are the cards that are behind him? Or what is he focusing his attention on, and what is he ignoring? But that is one man card. So the next few are all going to be man cards. So I'm going to go through them a little quickly. So that was one. Here's another one looking in the opposite direction. So because I like to do readings for same-sex couples, this would be maybe the partner of the first man card. But I like the way he looked. And here's another one. So this could be a younger man. But again, I like the way he looked. I love his hair. And then, again, I wanted men of different ethnicities, different races. So here's another one. And another one. And another man who may be a person of color but not be African American or Caucasian. And then I wanted someone who there was more of him to love. So there's that. I loved the image when I saw it. I'm like, I had to include him. And then I wanted someone who was physically disabled. And I just love the expression on this man's face. So I love the image so much I had to include it. So that's the last of all the men cards. Next card is managing your fixer. So this is an expression I learned, or a term I learned when I was doing my coach training. So my instructor, her name is Bridget, used this term, and what it means is that as a coach, you have to be careful about wanting to step in and fix the client situation for the client. That's not your job as a coach. Your job is to get them to fix their situation for themselves, right? It's all about empowering the person with the right tools, right, to fix their life, right? So this card can be about that, but it can also be about, for the coach, like, what is in your toolkit, right? And if you're not a coach and this card comes up and you don't identify with the managing your fixer part, meaning like you maybe part of your MO or part of your behavior or part of your tendency is to want to swoop in and save people. If that doesn't resonate, then this card is about like repairing damage, or building something up, because those are the things that we do with tools, right? So those are some of the possibilities with managing your fixer. Next up we have marriage. So there are a few marriage cards, again, with the intention that I wanted to have this deck be reflective of different types of couples and different types of marital situations. Okay, so here we have the first one, which is a heterosexual marriage. I love the image. Next we have gay marriage. lesbian marriage. And then I was going to stop there. And then I felt like I wanted to have seniors represented, you know. So here we have one of two. So here's a marriage card with two seniors. So this could be a long-term marriage, not necessarily seniors, but it could represent people who have been married for a long, long time. And then here's the second one. And this has people of color. So I love that. So those are the marriage cards, right? Next up, we have meditation. I love this image. Next up, we have mentor. And so mentor is a role that the coach does not assume, right? So sometimes the coach may refer the client to work with a mentor. And a mentor is a person who really just has experience with what the person is trying to accomplish. So now another meaning for this card, other than working with a mentor, could be, you know, an older man who wants to help the client in some way. An older, helpful man. And I didn't want to just leave it with that one, so I have a female mentor card. Next up, we have money and finances, you know, a subject that sometimes a coach helps a client with. So there's one with American currency, and then I wanted another one that had a combination of American and European currency. Because I work with an international client base. Next up, we have motivation. I love that image. So what motivates you? When the going gets tough, you have to remember what your why is, right? And so that's the motivation. Right? But I love the image because he's looking out into a field. So this could be talking about in the business or career sense, like what the field or industry that you're in. But it could just also be about exploring your options, broadening your horizons. It reminds me of the Three of Wands from Tarot, if you are Tarot fluent. And I'm talking about the Rider-Waite-Smith variation, where it has the man standing on a beach looking out into the sea. Right, so for me it has a similar kind of feel or vibe. Next up, we have the next step card. Right, so this would be, what is the next immediate step you could take in your process? Sometimes, and I love this with the image, sometimes we get wrapped up in the big picture, and sometimes we spend time looking way down the line and seeing something ahead that we feel we're not prepared for, we can't do, those kinds of things. But if you just concern yourself with the next immediate step, by the time you got to that point and you have taken all the steps closest to you, by the time you got to that point, you would be ready to do it because you had taken all the necessary steps beforehand, right? So the angels taught me that as a message in my work with them, about looking at the bigger picture and sometimes being focused on what we can't do because we're looking too far ahead. When if we take the steps from where we are to that point, by the time we got there, we would be more than prepared and more than qualified to do it. But this is next step. Next up is numerology. So numerology is actually the very first coaching thing that I did with clients. When I got my training, I worked with clients in careers and trying to establish what their career path was. And it was based on their life path number in numerology and their personal year cycles. And so sometimes with the work that I do now, sometimes I still refer to that. Sometimes I will look at the personal year cycle of the client to see what the energy of that numerical vibration is, and seeing how that might energetically be playing a part in what the person is trying to do. But if you're not into numerology, this card could just be about, working with numbers, the facts and figures, that kind of thing. But that is numerology, and I love the image. Next up, we have oracle cards. So this is the second. Now remember, way back early on, we had the Cartomancy card, right, which talked about things like playing cards, Lenormand, Kipper, the more cartomantic type systems, right? And oracle cards are different in this regard. Oracle cards offer, inspiration. They tend to be uplifting, positive in tone. Sometimes they have affirmations or mantras. So that is the difference between the two cards. Even though they still both talk about card reading, each type of system offers something unique and different, right? Now, this is one of the first angel card decks that I got, which is Healing with the Angels. And there's a nod to Archangel Michael in the image. And Archangel Michael, for me, can represent an angelic life coach in this regard. Archangel Michael can help us gain clarity about our next immediate action step. Right? So there's that. And Archangel Michael is good for cutting the cords. And the cords are energetic attachments that we form to either people, things, conditions, environments. When it comes to coaching, it could be forming an energetic attachment to a belief, and we can have Archangel Michael come in and cut the cords to that belief that is no longer serving and supporting us, right? That is actually keeping us from moving forward. So that is oracle cards. Next up, we have passion. So passion can represent what are you passionate about, what sets your heart on fire, because this is a heart that's in flames. So this could be about a burning desire. It's the love card in the deck for me. So you can think of, if you're fluent with Lenormand, this would be the same as heart in that system. So heart in Lenormand for me can represent passion and enthusiasm. But it can also represent love. Next up, we have perspective. So I love this card because it could be either one or two things. We're looking down into a hole, or we're in a hole and we're looking up. Like you've hit bottom, and there's only one way to go when you hit bottom, and that's to look up, right? It's only one way to go, that's up, right? But this could be looking into a new world, but typically this card would just represent a shift in your perspective. Would you be willing to see the situation in a different way? Next up, we have potential, and so symbol of an acorn, right? And so the idea about an acorn is that it holds the potential to become an oak tree, right? And so each of us has potential within us, and we get to choose whether we're going to tap into that potential or not. So that's potential. Next up, this is an image you'll probably recognize if you are familiar with my first deck, the Oracle of Himm. And this is the same image that I used for Archangel Metatron in that deck. And so because this is a picture of Metatron's cube, so there's a story behind this image. As an angel card reader, I have discovered that every time I pull a Metatron card, doesn't matter what the deck is, but when I pull a Metatron card, one or two things happens. The first is that I'm usually thrown a curve with my day in terms of getting work thrown my way that I didn't anticipate or expect, and as a result of that extra work, I have to rearrange my schedule and find a way to still get the other things I needed to get done along with this new task or this work, right? And so what I've learned is that I've called on Metatron to assist me with prioritizing, which is why the card is called Priorities, prioritizing those tasks and helping me with my time management. because Metatron also helps warp time. So this is one of two priorities cards because of the distinct message. When this card turns up, it's one of those two things for me, right? Now, underlying meaning could be along with the Angels card. If the Angels card was to turn up in a reading and this card came up too, it might be a nod to work more closely with Metatron and Metatron energy. Right, so that's priorities. That's the first one. Second one is an image of a to-do list, right? And so sometimes in my work with people, I will get them to list out, steps in a process that they need to make to achieve a goal. And then what I have them do after we list it all out is to rearrange the list in order of priority, right? And then we work the list from high priority, which is at the top of the list, down to maybe things that are not as high or lower priority, right? But again, coaching is a process about taking action, right? So it's not theoretical. It's not just stuff that's in your head. It's about doing something, right? So that's what this card would mean. If this card came up, the priorities card is about rearranging things and coming up with an actual list. We're going to sit down and make a list, and we're going to rearrange things in order of priority. What has to get done versus can we push this off, or maybe even eliminate it altogether. But that is the second priorities card. Next up, we have progress, right? So everything in a coaching relationship is about seeing progress being made, right? And again, this is about like it being a step-by-step process. Now, another meaning that I have for this card is about following in the footsteps of somebody else, right? And so sometimes it is a matter of, following somebody else's lead. Right, so that's progress. It's about seeing progress made step by step, maybe following in somebody else's footsteps. Next up is pros and cons. This is another one of those cards that's pretty self-explanatory. So this usually represents like weighing the pros and the cons of the situation. What are the pros? What are the cons? And now there's a coaching exercise in this card. If you notice, the background is yellow lined paper. So sometimes what I do with a client is we will actually list out what are the pros and the cons in the situation during a session so they can see it in black and white. Another twist on that is an exercise I call clarity through contrast. And that came about while I was in the beginning stages of studying the law of attraction. And so that idea is when people say, oh, I don't know what I want, or they're the type of person who may explain what they want by first talking about what they don't want, right? And so I work with that. So the contrast is all about the things that they don't want, right? And then once we list those things out, then we take a look at each one and say, okay, if this is the experience you're having, what would you rather have in its place? And that produces the clarity. Right? So pros and cons could be about weighing the pros and cons, or actually do an exercise where you write down the pros and the cons in a situation in an effort to help you decide. Or, the variation of that is the contrast, clarity through contrast, excuse me. So that is pros and cons. Next is the question card. So the obvious thing with the question card is all about the coaching conversation. The coach is usually the one who will ask questions to get the client to some type of insight, aha kind of moment. But the question card is all about asking the right question. For the coach, anyway. Now, it could also be about a question needing to be answered, or a mystery needing to be solved, something that we have a question mark around, that kind of thing. That's the question card. Next up is reflection. Sometimes as a coach, we give people food for thought, something to reflect on. Now, the image can also be about a ripple effect, you know? And so when you create change in one area of your life, it ripples out into other areas. Next, we have reframe. One of my favorite cards in the deck because I am a reframer. This is one of my favorite processes. And so a reframe is just asking you to look at your situation in a different way. Much like perspective. Sometimes it's about relanguaging your experience. Right? And what I love about the image is that behind the picture frame is a brick wall, right? A nod to the block card earlier. Right? So how can you reframe your experience to get you to move beyond the wall? Right? Or move beyond the block. Or if you're focusing so much attention on the block, could you relanguage your experience in a way that moves you away from the block as the focus? So that's reframe. Next up, we have a few relationship cards. Again, I set up the intention that I wanted these cards to represent different types of relationships. So first up, we have a heterosexual relationship with a man and a woman on the card. Next one, we have a gay relationship. So I love the image. But then I found this second one, and I was torn, so I put them both in the deck. So here's a secondary one. And I superimposed this couple over the backdrop of a pride flag. And then we have a lesbian couple. Right, so this is different than the marriage card. So the marriage card would represent an actual marriage or a seriously committed relationship, and then the relationship card would be like more like dating, or people who are still in the midst of forming a more intimate bond or connection, that kind of thing. Next up, we have resistance. So I love this image. So resistance is a card that represents like the times where I've proposed an idea to a client and the client just didn't want to hear it in the moment. I mean, you could clearly see by their body language they were not interested. And so sometimes I've called the person out and saying, I'm noticing a shift in your energy, or I'm seeing a shift in your posture or your body language. What's going on? Kind of thing. But so this card is reflective of those moments. And so sometimes it's like, are we saying no to something just for the sake of saying no, or just for the sake of being negative, which is why there's a black background behind the woman. But now it also has a directional cue. The card that is behind her, that she would have her back to, which would be to the right, would be possibly what it is that she has resistance to or what is being rejected. And then a card to the left would be maybe something that she's giving some thought or contemplation to. What she's considering because she's facing that card. Right, so that, again, directional cues are a nod to my work with systems like Lenormand and Kipper. So that's resistance. Next up, we have risk. So risk is all about taking chances, taking a risk. Sometimes things being a gamble, and you could win, quote unquote, some, or you could lose, quote unquote, some. But it really boils down to, are you willing to take the chance? Or chances. So that's risk. Next up, we have self-confidence. And I love this card. So I found the iconic image of Rosie. And I love that. And then I superimposed it over a pop art background that I created. And so the idea here is focusing on your strength, right? She's rolling up her sleeves. So it could be about like understanding like you're rolling up your sleeves metaphorically to get the work done, right? But it's also about, tapping into your strength. Again, that idea about, empowerment being repeated through several cards in different ways, right? But I love how this card came out. So that's self-confidence. Next up, we have another card that you'll probably recognize from my Oracle of Himm that I just transferred over and gave a different name to. In my Oracle of Himm, this is the affirmations card because of the I am. But in this deck, I called it self-talk, which is, again, why there's I am would fit with this, right? Because the I is talking about the self. It's about the individual, right? And so this card can come up to say, what are we saying about ourselves as we're moving through this process of change? Are we talking about ourselves in quote-unquote negative ways that are keeping us limited and stuck? Excuse me, I was about to say stuck. Or are we talking about ourselves in uplifting, positive ways that are going to help move us forward, right? So that is self-talk. And the yellow in the background is a nod to the solar plexus chakra, which is all about confidence. And I love, again, no mistake here, that this card comes after self-confidence, right? Then we have the spiritual guide card. So this could be about a spiritual teacher, spiritual leader, spiritual advisor. But what I love about the image, again, I wanted a different type of spiritual teacher. So I went with someone who is of a different culture. But what I love about the image is that he's pointing at you, kind of like the accountability card. So the gist of this card is about, you know, how we seek external teachers and gurus. But what I love about this card is saying you are your own guru. Right? So that is spiritual guide. Then we have the spirituality card. So again, this is like one of the aspects that a person could work on in terms of areas of life. So this would be like the money and finances card. That would be an area of life, right? Family would be another area of life type card. You know, so when a client comes to me, it's like, what area of life are we going to work on? Right? And so spiritual, the symbol of a spiral can represent evolution and ascension, right? So that's spirituality. Next up, we have success. And I just love this image. And success is relative, right? So success will mean different things to different people at different points in time. But that's success. Next up, we have talent, and I love the image. So this, again, is a nod about your gift, your talent, your ability. This could also represent a childhood talent that maybe you lost sight of or lost touch with. But the fact that the child on the card is playing an instrument, this could be about something being instrumental in helping you create change. You know, in a negative sense, the question could be here, like, are you playing the same tune again and again and again? And maybe it's time to change the tune. The last of the 3 system cards that I talked about, here we have tarot. And so now I already talked about cartomancy and I talked about oracle cards. Here for me, tarot is like spiritual psychology, because tarot, when I work with it anyway, can tell you like the underlying influence to a situation. Tarot is the thing for me that wants to probe deeper, right? Whereas cartomantic systems like Lenormand and Kipper can, you know, for all intents and purposes, really just tell you about an event or events that are taking place. But the tarot, for me, is designed with the, you know, taking a look deeper, taking a look at the underlying influences, you know, factors that may be within or without your control. And just like the other systems, it can have a predictive quality to it, but I tend not to focus on that so much when I work with tarot. But, you know, again, that's one of the 3 systems that I work with, and each one serves a different purpose and has a different intention, right? Different energy. So that's tarot. Next is one of the cards I really like in this deck, and this is the cut. So the cut can come up. It's the opposite in a way to the curtain call card, where I talked about, natural state of completion, endings and conclusions, right? Those kinds of things. The cut is the same way, only the ending is somewhat abrupt, right? It's sudden, it's unexpected, it's abrupt. It's kind of like Scythe in Lenormand, if you're Lenormand fluent. But this card can also be like, what do we need to cut out? What do we need to remove? What do we need to eliminate? So that's in the positive sense, right? It could be about like, cutting something away, but it could also be about something making the cut, right? And this card carries with it two ways to be read. You could look at the card on the left as signaling what's coming before the cut, and then the card that comes after it is what happens after the cut has been made. And then if I was doing maybe a 9-card box, and this card was below another card, the card that it was moving up towards could be about what's getting cut that way, visually speaking, because the scissors are pointing towards that particular card. One of the suggested pairs that this deck has spoken to me about is very interesting. So sometimes I'm off doing something else that has nothing to do with the deck, and then I will see card combinations being formed, and the cards will say, this is what this pair means. So for instance, if I got the Angels card with this card, it would symbolically represent Archangel Michael, right? Because Archangel Michael is known for cutting the cords, right? So that is the cut. I love how this card came out. Next up, we have therapy, and this is a very important card. A lot of times people have the misunderstanding or the misperception that coaching is like therapy. They are not the same. And so therapy, in my opinion, is a process that helps people deal with past issues that are keeping them from functioning to some degree in the present. Whereas coaching is about taking you from where you are in the present moment to where you want to be in the future. And it's the coach's responsibility that if he or she hears something from the client that sounds anything remotely therapeutic, is that they refer the client to a therapist. Now, what has happened to me more often than not in my experience as a coach is that most of the time, a client is already seeing a therapist when they come to work with me. And so in those instances, I am very mindful of saying to the client when I hear something therapeutic, that should be something you discuss with your therapist. Would you be willing to have that conversation with your therapist? And then sometimes, if the client has told the therapist that they are working with me as their coach, the therapist will say, I think James could help you with that. So it's a mutual respect for the other person's skill set. It's the best word I'll use in that regard. But it's about knowing the difference between a coaching situation versus a therapeutic situation. And if it's therapeutic, the coach's responsibility, ethically, is to refer the client to a therapist if the client is not already in therapy. And then you respect that relationship, and you don't try to be the armchair psychologist, and trying to counter the therapist's advice or suggestions or guidance with that client, right? You don't do it. That's a no-no, right? So this is therapy. Oh, this is one of the cards I was so happy to put in the deck. So as I was ruminating about the different types of people that I wanted to have represented in the deck, and I really wanted people of different races to be represented and different sexual orientations to be represented, I was reminded of gender fluidity. I have one client who I worked with years ago, and she has a child who refers to themselves as they and them, right? So they are non-binary is the term. So I wanted the card that would represent that. So I created the they, them card. And so the image is very simple. It has the icon of people in different genders on top, superimposed over the gender fluid flag. So this is they, them. Now, if it's not about gender fluidity or being non-binary, then this card could also be a card that represents a multiple of people, right? Because there's more than one person on the card. But first and foremost, it is about being gender fluid. Next up, we have time. And so this is a card that has already been speaking to me. I pulled it today. I'm shooting this video on July the 15th, 2020. And so this was a card that I pulled in my 3 cards because I'm working with the deck. Now that I have a physical copy, I'm working with the deck on a daily basis, and I'm drawing 3 cards every day. So this was the center of the 3 cards in the focus, in the middle. And so I had, I guess the best way to language it is I had an internal conversation or realization about time. So this card was making me think of time streams versus timelines, right? And so the idea here is that time is not something that's linear, which is what a line is, right? And time runs in time streams. And so maybe at some point I'll talk more about that. But that was an interesting realization that I was having in the moment with myself. So, but time talks about time, timing. You know, the idea with the sand is time running out. You know, this could be about time management, all those kinds of things, right? So that's time. Next, here's another card that I am so happy I have in the deck. So this is a card that is a nod to people who are transgendered, just like the they, them card. After I made that card, I wanted to have a card that represents trans people, because I know some. And every time I thought I was done in terms of representation, I felt like, no, I've left people out. And so I love this image. So the image is evocative to me anyway about the transition one makes from one gender to the next. And the face in the middle represents the core of who that person is as they're transitioning from one gender to the other, right? What it is that the face represents them at the core, their internal self. And they just want the outside to match the inside. But I love the image. So that's my transgender card. Next up, we have transpersonal psychology, which is the branch, excuse me, the branch of psychology that I studied. It was technically called health and wellness, but really transpersonal psychology is all about helping people in a way that focuses more on their strengths rather than their weaknesses or their liabilities, right? And sometimes practices like dream work go hand in hand with transpersonal psychology. So that's a nod back to my dream decoding card. But what I love about the image is that this is all about exploring concepts, theories. You know, it's about, you know, being open to a paradigm shift. But transpersonal psychology in and of itself focuses on our strengths and coming from that place rather than a place of weakness or limitation and restriction. So that's that card. Next up we have travel. So that's an obvious nod to travel. And this could be long distance travel because of the plane. But the plane is also a nod for commercial ventures and launching something, right? Getting something up and running. And that would be, especially if the business card came up in a reading with this card. In a spiritual sense, this could be about moving into higher planes of consciousness. Right, so that's travel. Next up is trial and error. So this card is basically, just like it says, It's all about, experimenting with something. Sometimes you have to do something more than once. Sometimes you may quote unquote fail at something, but the failure is bringing you one step closer to success, right? Now she has the periodic table of elements in the background behind her. So that just represents, combination of the right and perfect elements, bringing elements together. Other meanings for me with this card, this could represent a mixologist, right? This could be about lab work, clinical trials, things of that nature, especially with what's going on in the collective with the pandemic. This could be about, creating a vaccine. So that is trial and error. Next up, we have unconscious. So this is a nod to the opposite or the counter to the conscious card earlier on. And so for me, this is about, being shown in some way an aspect, of our shadow side. This is taking a look at maybe our ego. I'm looking at the image and it looks like the man is reactive. So this could be about acting out, and maybe acting out in ways that are not healthy. But it can also be with the word unconscious, just being in a place where we are not as aware as we could be. So you think about having unconscious patterns. I talked about it already, habits, tendencies. But when this card comes up, it's about taking a look at that or being shown an aspect of that. And the other thing about the image is not being able to see the entire picture. Right? Because you can't see his entire face, right? So it could be like being in the dark because you can't see the entire picture. Meaning you don't have all the information, you don't have all the facts, those kinds of things. But this is unconscious. Next up is vision. So I went with a really simple image here. So I found a pair of eyes and I superimposed it over pop art background of pink and purple. That was intentional. The pink and purple can represent the upper chakras, so that would be a nod to the brow chakra and the crown chakra. And then that would make vision, in the spiritual sense, a card that talks about second sight. It's kind of like the clairvoyance card in my first deck, the Oracle of Himm, right? But if it's not that, then this is about vision, it's about focus, it's about sight, it's about perception, it's about observation. It could be about monitoring a situation, keeping an eye or keeping your eyes on something. It could be about not losing sight of where you are or where you want to go. Keeping your eyes on the prize. All those things with vision. Right? But the first thing I usually ask with a new client is what's the vision? What do you see? Now, it's not about what do I see as the coach. It's about what does the person see? Right? So that's vision. Wellness is the next card. So this is just about your well-being. And I love this image. So this card can also be about immersing yourself into something new. But it's usually about taking care of yourself. This is about practicing good self-care. So that's wellness. Next card is the Wheel of Life. And so this is about, cycles and patterns. But in coaching, the Wheel of Life is actually a model that we use to help the client rate their life. So basically, it's divided up into different sections of life. And then we ask the client to rate each section, each aspect, on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 being everything's great, everything's wonderful, everything's perfect, quote unquote, to 1 where, it's not going well at all. right? And I am not happy in this area of my life, right? And sometimes when the client can see the numerical scales of each aspect, then they may shift their focus. They may be thinking like, oh, I wanted to work on this area of my life, but I'm seeing like I'm really not satisfied with anything that's going on over on this side. So what can we do with that, right? But the other thing about this card is that helping the client understand, in a way, that when you work on one area of your life, you work on changing all the areas. This is about a more holistic approach to change, right? So that is the Wheel of Life. Next up, we have one of two cards called Wisdom. So this is the first. This is a Lama, like the Dalai Lama. And so this card represents wisdom gained through experience. But it can also represent older people like a grandparent, right? Where I talked about the mentor card can be about an older person. Those could be like parents even, the mentor cards. But this would be like grandparents. And so that's the male wisdom card. And then I have a female wisdom card. And so my thought for the female one, when I was looking for one, I had the idea of the Oracle from the Matrix movies in mind, which is why she is an African American woman, because that was my inspiration for this card. But isn't she great? So we have a female wisdom card. Next up, we have some women cards, just like we had men cards. Have to have women cards, right? Again, this is a nod to Lenormand with the lady card and Kipper with the main female card. So I have several options here for women. So here's one. Here's another. This is my favorite. So in my personal work with this deck, I use this one, but I love her. And again, going with the man card that I am using as my favorite, they can face each other in readings. So there's that possibility there, which is like a built-in Lenormand and Kipper thing. And then here we have some variations of women. So here's another one. I love this one. It's a combination of a woman who is a person of color, but not African American. But I also like the retro look of her outfit and her hair. Here's another one. I wanted one to represent full-figured women or plus-size women. And so I love her. And then I also wanted a woman who represents physically disabled women. So here we are to the final card in the deck, which is the Work and Career card. Now again, do you notice the nod to the superhero in the background with the shadow, right? Again, that theme about working with your superpower. What is your talent? What is your gift or gifts or abilities that you bring to your work and your career, right? And the fact that he's moving up the stairs is a nod to advancement, like career advancement. The idea about moving up the ladder. But again, this is another one of those life aspect or life area cards, right? Just like family and money and finances and spirituality. So that is the final card, and that is the Intuitive Coaching Oracle as a whole. And there you have it. That is my second deck, the Intuitive Coaching Oracle in all its glory, and I am so excited. If you hung in there with me this far, I want to thank you for the gift of your time. I know this was a long video, and I know you could have done a number of things with that time, so I am honored and I am grateful that you have chosen to spend it with me, so thank you. So where do we go from here, right? So this is my intention. When I created the deck, my intention was because it was inspired by a prospective coaching client that I wanted to have a deck that represented me and my business to use with my personal clients offering readings. So that was my first intention with the deck. When I started sharing the cards on social media. So I started sharing them on Instagram and YouTube, on my community page, and over on Facebook. People started expressing interest in the deck. They started asking me, is the deck going to be available to the public? When is the deck going to be available to the public? I would love to own and work with that deck. And so I was thinking, like, more so than my first deck, the Oracle of Himm, I'm really feeling like this would be the deck that I would make available to the public. But there are some things that I have to do before that can happen. I have to do my due diligence, I feel, and this is a way for me to dot my I's and cross my T's, is that I want to go back and I want to be sure without a shadow of a doubt that all the images that I sourced and resourced were indeed copyright free. I feel like they are, but it's just a way for me to double check that. And so if there are any images that I feel may be in question, then I want to go and change those. I would keep them for my own personal deck, of course, because it's my deck. But if I'm going to put it out into the world, I want to make sure that I am not in any way infringing on somebody else's copyright. So I would like to make sure that that is a done deal. The other thing that I'm working on right now is I'm working on an LWB, and so for those of you who are in the know, that is a little white book that usually accompanies a tarot deck or an oracle card deck. You know, it's usually like a little pamphlet or something that goes inside with the deck, and I'm working on that now, and it's really just going to have brief meanings of what the cards are, and that will give me time to work on maybe an expanded guidebook or companion book that would go with that. But I really wanted to have something that people could work with initially. So there's that. Then it comes to the idea of packaging. Like, you know, do I want a plain white tuck box? Do I want a custom box? And if I want a custom box, I have to create a design for that. Because my copy came in a metal tin. So, you know, I have to look at the options for packaging. And then I have to keep in mind the cost kind of thing. So there's all those opportunities for growth and development, right? For the growth and development of myself as the creator and the deck itself, right? So all those things I have to work on, as well as how do I want to sell the deck, you know, where is going to be the marketplace for it. And so there's options I need to look at for that. So all those things are going to take some time, so I don't know when officially the deck will be made available to the public, but I am so excited to get moving on this, more so interestingly than I was with my first deck. My first deck, I was feeling that it was really personal, and I felt really vulnerable sharing all of that deck with the public. And so I enjoyed the response of those of you who watched that and were so inclined to offer words of support and encouragement, and actually even people who said they were interested in getting a copy of the deck. I was feeling really vulnerable with that. I'm still feeling vulnerable with this because of the time this was birthed and what was going on in the world, and you know, feeling like that was a creative response to that. So I'm still feeling vulnerable about that, but I'm also wanting this to be made available to those who want to work with it, because it's customizable, right? You can take out the cards that don't resonate with you and keep the ones that do. And so with that in mind, lots of people could make their own decks, and each deck would be unique to the person, right? Just as the deck would be unique to me in my way, because I don't use all the cards. It would be the same for every person who owned a copy. So there's that interesting aspect that I like about that. So that's all the things, or those are all the things I should say, I need to attend to going forward. So I'm just going to invite everybody to just be as patient as you can in my process. I do have a lot going on. I'm currently working 2 jobs, and right now in this space I'm doing a 3rd house sitting gig, so there's that. And in addition to, you know, the work that I do with my personal clients right now, it's very interesting. I talked about how business had slowed at some point because of the pandemic, and now I'm getting a resurgence, a slow resurgence of business, but even a slow resurgence is still a resurgence, right? So I'm experiencing all that. So right now, my schedule is pretty packed. It's a nice way of putting it. It's pretty packed. So it's going to take some time. So I'm just, like I said, I'm just going to ask everybody to be patient and just stay tuned. And I will keep you all updated on the process and the progress within the process. So this is James Himm Mitchell. I am closing out. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me through this video exploring my second deck, the Intuitive Coaching Oracle. And as I wrap up, I wish you the best of days, and I'm hoping that you and I will connect again around this deck in the future. Take care.